Hey everyone, we're back. We're still in the Encyclopedia of the Ancient World, and today we're going to be looking at the death and afterlife of the ancient Egyptians. So, as we've already talked about some, their religion was extremely important to them, and part of that was their afterlife. Okay, the spirit world was extremely important to them as well. So, a person's spirit had different parts, and very important parts. Okay, so the first part we'll talk about is the Ka. It was the spirit double. It looked like the person, but could leave the body and had to return to the body for food and refreshments. The next one is the Ba, which was the person's life force. It needed the body to, quote, perch on like a bird. So the Ka and the Ba, the two are the most important parts. But also we had the Ak, which could soar to join the stars, and the Nam, which was important because without that, you just didn't even exist. So these were all very important parts of the spirit world and parts of what they believed in their present lives. And so they spent a lot of time in the living world preparing for the spirit for the afterlife. And that's where we started to get, the attempts at embalming or the mummification. But the first ones they didn't embalm. They just dried them out in the deserts. They set them out in the deserts to dry sand and air, and they just dried the bodies out, and then they would bury them in the deserts. But they had funerals as well. So once the body was dried out, the body would be carried to the west bank of the Nile. A purification ritual would happen before the mummification. They placed it in a coffin and took it to a tomb. There, the family and friends carried everything that they would need in the afterlife to the tomb. You also had professional mourners that would follow along. They would follow along and cry and wail and scream out and just, try to make it be as sad as they possibly could. Another thing that occurred with the body was during the ceremony was they would go get to the tomb and perform the ceremony. It was the opening of the mouth. The priest would touch the hands, the feet, the eyes, the ears, the nose, and the lips and open the mouth. And this was so that all the senses could be freed so they could function properly in the next world, in the afterlife. Then the coffins and all the goods that the family brought would be placed in the tomb, and the tomb would be sealed up in hopes that nobody would bother it, and so everything would be there for them. So then they would have to go on this journey, the dead person, a journey into the next world. It was long and dangerous for the Ba. Okay? And remember, the Ba is that person's life force. So, first thing they would have to do is pass the gates guarded by monsters to a place of judgment. They had to recite a long list of sins before 42 judges. And there the god Anubis would decide your fate. And he would take your heart and balance it against the feathers of Mot Thoth. Okay? And that's the god of truth. And so, if you had a good life, your heart would be lighter than the feather, and you would get to pass on to meet Osiris and your ancestors. But if you had a bad life, your heart would be heavy with sin, much heavier than the feather, and you'd be eaten by the crocodile-headed monster Amut. Excuse me. So these were all parts of the process of being into the afterlife, and they'd spent a lot of time on this during their living lives. And the process of drying things out, the bodies out in the sand, wasn't working so well. So they kept trying to improve that because they needed these bodies to last for eternity, basically. So then they started to get into the embalming and the mummification process. And this all started in the New Kingdom with this new method. And this method would take about 70 days to perfect, okay? They would start with a little slit on the side of the body, and the viscera would be removed. And each of these parts that they would remove would be embalmed separately and placed in little jars, okay? Canopic jars. So first thing they would take was the liver, and the liver would be protected by Imseti, which was a human-formed god. Then the lungs, which would be protected by Hapi, which was a baboon. The intestines, protected by Kobessinif, which was a falcon, and lastly the stomach, which was protected by Damatef, which was the jackal. The heart, very important part, remember, has to be weighed against the balances, was left in the body so it could be judged in the afterlife. Then once these parts were removed, they would take this natron, which is kind of like a salt type substance, a salt type preservative, and they would soak up all the moisture with this, basically cover the whole entire body in it. And after about 35 to 40 days, the body would be completely dry. Once the body was dry, they would stuff it with materials soaked in oil and resins to keep its natural shape of the body. And then the body would be sewn up. Once the body was sewn up, they would wrap the entire body in layers of linen. Started with the fingers and the toes with real small pieces of wrapping and worked their way across the whole entire body. Different jewels and amulets would be placed between the layers. Each layer was covered in oil and resins and perfumes. Then, at a certain point, a mask would be placed over the mummy's head, and this was all done by the chief embalmer, who wore the jackal mask. The jackal was the embalming god of Anubis, okay? And then the mummy would be placed in a coffin. So, the mummies and their secrets would hopefully be kept safe for eternity. The word mummy comes from the word mumaya, which means bitumen. And the bitumen was this thick tar-like substance that was created over time from all the oils and resin and stuff that was used to wrap in the stage. And eventually it would cover the whole entire mummy in this kind of tar-like sticky substance. And we found all this out because as we started to excavate and started to do things, we would discover mummies, and they would take these 19th century mummies and often unwrap them. And then they would find these jewels that were hidden in there, and they'd find different things that would be able to tell how the body was preserved and different things like that. But it also badly damaged the bodies, okay? And that was turning into a problem. So now, with all our new modern technology and things, most of these mummies are not unwrapped. They use CAT scans and other, medical devices and things to be able to tell what's in the body and learn a lot more than they could from the past even. So once we get the body completely preserved and ready to go, it has to be put somewhere. And the first thing it was put in was a coffin. And the coffins and the tombs were extremely important as well. They were as important as the embalming processes, okay? These coffins were lavishly decorated. They had inscriptions written all over them of things that they would need to know in the afterlife. The Old and Middle Kingdoms basically had coffins and sarcophagi by mostly the rich, and they were rectangular shaped, brightly painted. On the outside, they would have the Eye of Ujat. And the Eye of the Ujat was on the outside of the coffin in the same location as the eyes would be on the body, so the dead person could see out and see through and be able to live in the afterlife, not having to not see. Eventually, they started making human-shaped coffins that would be decorated and painted like the person, so the Eye of the Ujat was not needed because the coffin had its own face painted correctly on the coffin itself. Then the coffin, because it still wasn't good enough trying to preserve it and keep it safe from people, would be placed in a sarcophagus, okay? Which was a large outer coffin, basically, usually made of stone, and would be completely sealed off by the time they were done. Then they would take that and place it in some type of tomb. Many different shapes and sizes of tombs. Sometimes it was just a cave, sometimes it was a rock cutout, could be a mastaba or some type of temple, all the way up to, the pharaohs and their pyramids, okay? So those were all very important parts of the process. But usually it was, again, only for the rich. The poor at this point were still just buried in the sand. The burial chamber also was important. It was found in all the tombs, a separate spot just for the tomb, okay, for the burial part. The chamber was for the sarcophagus and the coffin, and it was completely sealed off as well. There was usually false doors to try to hide the exact location of it to avoid people from looting it. And painted or carved on the inside were, again, false doors and things. And sometimes these doors they believed would be so the ka could go in and out. Usually in these tombs there was other chambers as well, especially the bigger they got, the more, elaborate they were. The pyramids would have multiple chambers, false chambers. Most of them also had some type of chapel and a storage area for the food and supplies that they would need. And speaking of what they would need, what did they need for the afterlife? Basically, everything they still needed in the living life, okay? So some of the things they had was the ushabtis, which were little carved figures, okay? And they basically were supposed to represent the servants. So they were the dead person's servants, so that they were ready to obey orders and work and do all the hard work that this person may need done in the afterlife. Just in case there was hard work that needed to be done. They also had very powerful paintings, but these paintings were not just for decorations. They showed them how to do the things that needed in the afterlife, okay? And they were paintings, there were reliefs, there were carvings, there were writings. Some of the text and writings were to guide, again, the person in the afterlife. They also put on their spells and prayers on the pyramid text so that they had the knowledge of what they needed. Some of the other texts that they found, especially in the pyramid text, was they had coffin text as well, stuff on the coffins. And in the Middle Kingdom, the less rich, but on the coffins, okay? The New Kingdoms were where it got very elaborate, and they would have the Book of the Dead usually written all over the tomb or the burial chamber. And there was 5 parts to survive according to the Book of the Dead in the afterlife, okay? 5 parts to survive the afterlife. One was the book of what is in the afterlife. The book of gates, which was helping them learn how to get past the monsters and at the gates. The book of caverns to help them navigate their way. The book of earth. And the litany of Ra, okay? All of this goes to show you just how important the whole process was. They spent a large majority of their life, the living life, preparing for the afterlife and making sure that their spirit was ready to go. They would practice all these techniques. They learned how to embalm and perfect that. They would create tombs. They would have coffins and sarcophagus and chambers, all to make sure that they preserve themselves for the afterlife so they could continue to live on in a peaceful way that they needed. And it just shows that it's extremely important. Thanks.